In this tutorial, we'll provide a guided tour of the Burp Suite user interface, and we'll point out many of the cool tools, features, and options that you need to know about to get full value from Burp Suite. So when Burp first opens, you see the project launcher here. This is where you can select what kind of project to create or open and the configuration options to use. We cover this in a different tutorial, so for now I'm just going to launch a default new project. In the main Burp UI, at the top we have a series of tabs containing different Burp tools and options, and this is the quickest way to get into the different areas of Burp that you'll need to be working with. So in the Dashboard tab, this is where you can view and configure Burp's automated tasks, things like scans and live tasks. You can also see other data that's generated as Burp runs. So just to see that in action very quickly, I'm just going to run a very quick scan. Kicking off that scan opens the task. It creates this entry on the dashboard, and we can see details of the scan as it progresses. So here we can see the requests that are being made, the numbers of issues that are being reported. Under issue activity, we can see a live list of all of the issues as they are discovered from anywhere within Burp. And under the event log, we can see a log of interesting events and other information that's occurred. If we click on View Details on a task, this opens a window just for that task where we can see more detailed information about it. So for a scan, we can see all of the items that are being audited. We can again see the issue activity log just for this scan and the event log just for this scan. In the Target tab, this is where Burp records all of the information that has been found against different websites that you browse or websites that you scan. So on the left, we have a folder view of the URL structure on each site. Then we can see the content that exists at different URLs. And finally, we can see the issues that have been reported. Under Target Scope, you can tell Burp exactly what websites you are targeting, what's in scope and what's out of scope. And you can use Target Scope to drive all kinds of cool features throughout Burp. We'll cover Target Scope in a separate tutorial. The Proxy is the tool that you use to intercept, view and modify traffic between your browser and the target server. So just to very quickly see how that works, I'm going to open Burp's browser and visit a URL. Here in the Intercept view, we can forward, edit different requests that are happening and responses. I'm just going to forward everything for now. In the HTTP history view, we can see all of the requests that have been made. Look at the requests, look at the responses. We can do the same for WebSockets history if the application is using WebSockets. And we could also, in the Options tab, control all of the settings that are used to fine-tune the behavior of Burp Proxy. So one thing that's useful is anywhere you see a config panel in Burp, or many other panels as well, you have these icons. If we click on the question mark, we get some immediate contextual inline documentation for the feature that we're looking at. And if you click on the gear icon, this is where you can load or save the options just from this panel, or you can just restore defaults if you need to. Burp Intruder is a tool that is used for automating custom attacks. So the way this works is you send a request into Intruder from elsewhere in Burp. So if we go to the proxy history and find a suitable request, we can do Send to Intruder. This opens a new tab in Intruder just for this request. We can configure the target, details of where we want payloads to go, and details of the payloads themselves. We'll cover how to use Burp Intruder in a separate tutorial. Burp Repeater is used to reissue an individual request and modify it and send it again over and over. So if we do the same, if we send a request to Burp Repeater, here the request appears. We can edit it, we can click send, and we can see the response. Again, Burp Repeater is covered in a separate tutorial. Moving along the top, we have various other tools you use more occasionally. So Burp Sequencer is used to analyze the randomness, the entropy that is contained in session tokens or other data that needs to be random. It runs various statistical tests on a big data sample to tell you if the data appears to be random. Burp Decoder is used to decode and encode data in various formats. So if you run into data that is URL encoded, HTML encoded, base64 encoded, you can work with it here. Burp Comparer is used to do a word or byte level comparison between different items of data. So for example, if you have two big responses that are very similar and contain some minor differences, you can send them to Burp Comparer and it will highlight exactly where the differences are. Burp Extender is used to customize Burp's behavior by loading Burp extensions. So these can be extensions that you've written yourself using the Burp Extender API, or they can be extensions from the BAP store that have been written by other Burp users. So there are hundreds of extensions here that have been contributed by the Burp user community. These are used to enhance Burp's behavior in all kinds of ways. So it's really worth playing with some of these. Under project options, we have numerous categories of option that affect how Burp will work in relation to the current project. So project options are saved in your project file. If you're using a project file, you can save them in config files and load them again. We cover that in a separate tutorial. But all of these settings are divided into separate areas covering network connections, HTTP, TLS, session handling, and some other areas. Under user options are a different set of options that are more around your own installation of Burp and how you want it to behave, which aren't tied to particular projects. So some interesting options here under display. This is where you can configure font size of your interface and whether to use a dark theme or a light theme. So Burp will support both flavors of interface according to your preference. Under miscellaneous, you can configure hotkeys. So Burp supports tons of hotkeys for different common actions, and this is where you can configure those. There are many options that are hotkeyable, which don't have a hotkey assigned by default, and you can define one here if it's an action that you use a lot. It's worth noting that there are some options which can be defined at the user level and at the project level. So if you take, say, upstream proxy servers, if you're working on a penetration test for a particular client engagement, you might be on their network and need to configure a certain proxy server. You would do that under project options and configure that here by overriding the user options for this project. Whereas if you have a proxy server on your home network that you use by default, anytime you're there, you can set it here in user options, and that will be the one that is used if you don't override it. You can use the context menu within Burp everywhere. Everywhere you see an entry in a table, or anytime you see an individual HTTP request, you can use the context menu to access all kinds of actions. So you can send just this request to be scanned with a passive scan, active scan, or a configurable scan. You could send it to individual Burp tools to drive additional testing workflows. You can view it in your browser. You can use various engagement tools for common purposes. So if you want to know other locations that link to a particular URL, particular request, you can use find references. You can use content discovery, where Burp will use big word lists to try to discover content beneath a URL that isn't necessarily linked. You can schedule tasks. You can create a CSRF POC, do various other things. In the menu bar at the top of the Burp UI, we have various other options. So on the Burp menu, we can do a search. This will search through all of the data in different Burp tools for items that match a particular expression. You can access Burp's configuration library. This is where you can maintain your own config files for different purposes or access various built-in configurations that come with Burp. Under user options, you can restore defaults for all of your user options, or you can save your current user options to a config file or load it back later. Also on the Burp menu, we have various other tools that you will use occasionally. So Burp Infiltrator is an IAST tool that can be used to instrument an application that you plan to scan so that you can see inside the application as it's running and get a lot more interesting information about it and find some dangerous code paths where your payloads might be hitting a vulnerability. Burp Click Bandit is a tool for generating clickjacking attacks. So the way this works is you copy the Click Bandit script into your browser and you then walk through the sequence of actions that you want a victim to execute, and Click Bandit will generate a proof of concept clickjacking attack. Burp Collaborator Client lets you work manually with Burp Collaborator payloads. You can use this to generate Burp Collaborator payloads, copy them to your clipboard. You can then use them in your own attacks, sending requests through Burp Repeater or as payloads in Burp Intruder or anything like that. And then you can poll for collaborator interactions to see the results of using those payloads. We'll cover Burp Collaborator and the Burp Collaborator client in a separate tutorial. In the project menu, you can also, as for user options, you can restore defaults for project options. You can save them to a config file or load them back. You can save a copy of your project. So if you've started work in a temporary project, you decide you want to save it, you can save it to a project file. Or if you're already working in a project file, you can save a copy. There are some menu options for the intruder and repeater tools, which we'll cover in separate tutorials. In the window menu, you can detach individual Burp tools, float them out as a separate window if you want to arrange your UI that way. As well as detaching and reattaching individual tools, you can reorder the top level tabs if you prefer them to be in a different sequence. In the help menu, you can access Burp's documentation, getting started help, you can go to the support center, you can see diagnostic information about your installation if you're experiencing any problems. If the embedded browser is not working correctly on your platform, you can run the health check to find out why. You can update your Burp license, check for updates, and other things. So that's a general guide to the Burp Suite user interface. Do check out our other video tutorials for more details on using each of the Burp Suite tools, features, and options that we've mentioned. In this tutorial, we're going to cover intercepting HTTP requests and responses in Burp Suite Pro and Community Edition. So Burp Suite can act as a man in the middle between your browser and the website you're testing. This lets Burp intercept, view, modify all traffic in both directions. Burp can even get inside encrypted connections that use TLS or SSL. For manual testers, this is the foundation of your testing workflow. You generally start using your browser, intercepting traffic and analyzing it, and that leads on to other tasks and other Burp tools for more specific actions. So Burp Proxy is the tool to do interception with. If we go to Burp, if we click on the Proxy tab, this is the Proxy tool. We've got an Intercept tab. We've got the HTTP history, where you'll see the messages that have been processed. We've also got WebSockets history for WebSockets messages, and we've got the Options tab, where you can control all the configuration options for how Burp Proxy works. So the easiest way to start is to go to the Intercept tab and click on the Open Browser button. This will launch Burp's embedded browser pre-configured to work with Burp Suite. This means that the browser will talk to Burp's proxy listener and it will work with Burp's TLS. So we click on Open Browser, the browser opens as normal. We then can visit any website in the normal way, and you can see straight away in Burp we have an intercepted request. So in the intercept view, requests are stalled for you to view, edit, forward, or drop. So we can read the full request, we can go in and edit it as we want to, we can forward it on to the server, we can drop it so that it just doesn't get processed any further, and we have other actions that we can use to send the request to other Burp tools like Burp Repeater or Burp Intruder to perform vulnerability scans, everything else. For now, I'm going to forward the request on, and you can see there are other requests that happen and some other ones with page resources and a few other bits and pieces. So we click forward to all of these. Eventually, the page load completes, and there we are with the website in the browser. Now, if you get bored of constantly clicking forward, one thing you can do is use this master intercept toggle. So if we just turn interception off, if we go back to our browser, refresh the the page now loads and we didn't have any messages to intercept. So if you want to switch between testing manually and intercepting and just browsing as normal, this is the easiest, quickest way to do that. One little gotcha that catches out some new users and even catches out a lot of experienced users is that if you leave your master interception on and you forget about it, and then if you start to browse around, what you will see is that the page never loads. The browser spins indefinitely, waiting because its traffic is getting stalled. So always keep an eye on whether you have interception turned on or off. Now, by default, Burp will intercept just requests, and certain file extensions in URLs are skipped and not intercepted. This just makes life easier because generally when you're doing testing, you're interested in requests and you're generally less interested in certain file extensions, certain file types. But we can configure all of that. So in the Proxy tool, if we go to the Options tab, we then have options here for intercepting client requests and server responses. What we have here are a bunch of rules that you can define to just tell Burp whether to intercept requests based on various kinds of characteristics that requests have, and you can do the same for responses as well. So this gives you really granular control of exactly what gets intercepted. We'll cover all these options in more detail in another tutorial. Worth noting that there are different options for responses. And if you want to intercept responses, you tick this box to say intercept responses, and then you can configure the rules in the normal way. This is another gotcha, or actually a common feature request we get is from new users asking, can we make Burp intercept responses? Well, of course it can, and you just need to enable it if you want that. Now there's one other option which many people don't know about, but is really useful if you work a lot with Burp Proxy. If you go to User Options and MISC and go down to Proxy Interception, here you can configure whether Proxy Interception is enabled at startup. So you can say that you want it always enabled or always disabled, or you can remember the state it was in when Burp was last closed and restore that. So that's intercepting HTTP requests and responses using Burp Proxy, and various options you can use to configure how interception works. In this tutorial, we'll cover how to resend individual HTTP requests using Burp Repeater, and we'll look at various related workflows and options that you can use to support your testing. So Burp Suite Repeater is the tool that you can use to resend individual requests, modify them, and issue them over and over. The easiest way to use Burp Repeater is to send requests to it from other tools in Burp. So Burp Suite, you can send requests between Burp tools anywhere that you see them. So I'm going to launch Burp's embedded browser and visit a website. The request is intercepted in Burp Proxy, so we can use the context menu and select Send to Repeater from here. Or if we prefer, we can go to the HTTP history. We can click on any request that we're interested in. Again, use the context menu, select Send to Repeater. Or we can go to the Target tab and select an item that we're interested in and do Send to Repeater from the context menu again. Or from any individual request panel, we can do the same. So if we send a request to Repeater, there it appears. And on the left-hand side, in the request panel, we can see the request and we can also edit it. We can click Send to issue the request, and then on the right-hand side in the response panel, we can see the response that came back from the server. If we want, we can send the request over and over. We can edit it and send it again, change it again. We can try different things, get different status codes back, different responses. Next to the send and cancel button, we have these back and forwards buttons where we can walk through the history of requests that we've made and see each request and response. And on each button, there's a little drop down where we can jump straight to an item in our history if we want to send that request again. Burp Repeater can also handle redirects. So if we find a request that caused a redirection response and send that to Repeater, here we can see the server replied with 301 status code, which is a redirection. And we now have this follow redirection button. If we click that, but we'll update the request on the left to be the redirected request, and it will show the response from that on the right. If we want, we can do this automatically. So if we go to the Repeater menu, we have these options for follow redirections. If we turn those on, we hit send. This time, but automatically follow the redirect, and we see the final response on the right. And down at the bottom in the status bar, that tells us that it followed one redirection. There are some other handy options on the Repeater menu. So by default, Burp Repeater will update the content length as you edit requests. If you prefer, you can turn that off. By default, Burp will unpack gzip and deflate content in responses. If you prefer, you can turn that off. You can tell Burp whether to process cookies in redirects. You can change the view of Repeater, so you can have top-bottom split or other views if you prefer. You can use hotkeys to send items to Burp Repeater. So we select an item and type Control-R or Command-R on Mac. That request comes into Repeater. We can also use Control Space or Command Space to issue the request. You can configure Burp's hotkeys by going to User Options, MISC, and editing the configured hotkeys here. If you send multiple requests to Repeater, each one will create a different tab in Repeater where you can work. So each tab has its own request and response panels, it has its own history, so you can work independently on different requests. This is really handy in your testing workflow if you are testing different endpoints of the application, different features, and you want to play with one request for a bit, switch and work on something else. You can then keep your work and easily switch back. If you want, you could rename tabs by clicking on the tab header and typing in a different name for the tab. This lets you easily label your tabs so you can come back to them and remember where you left off. You could reorder tabs by dragging them in the tab header. If you're finished with a tab, you can close it by clicking on the little X. And there's one more way to start off with Burp Repeater, and that is you can click on these little three dots to create a new tab. And here we're going to say type HTTP because we're working on HTTP requests. If we were working on WebSockets, we would select that option and it would create a different UI for working on WebSockets messages. We'll cover WebSockets testing in a different tutorial. So if we click on HTTP, we get a new empty tab with no request or response, no target details specified. So we could configure all of these manually, but there's another nice little feature in Burp. If you have a URL that you're interested in, if you copy that to the clipboard, you can then select paste URL as request. That will then create a request and configure the target details from that URL, and you can then send it. So that's how to resend individual HTTP requests with Burp Repeater and various related workflows and options. In this tutorial, we'll cover how to scan a website for vulnerabilities using Burp Scanner, how to monitor what scans are doing while they're running, and how to export results. There are two basic ways of performing vulnerability scans using Burp. First, you can let Burp do an end-to-end managed scan. That means crawling to discover content and functionality, and then auditing for vulnerabilities. And the second way is that you can select individual items to be audited. So let's look at the first way, which is performing an end-to-end managed scan. The way you launch one of these is you go to the Burp dashboard and you click on New Scan. This opens the scan launcher. You see at the top, you have an option for the scan type. So you could select whether to do a crawl and audit, which is the default, or whether just to crawl to discover content. So we're going to leave it on crawl and audit. Then you need to enter a URL or multiple URLs to scan. So I'm going to enter a URL there. Under protocol settings, you have an option whether to scan using both HTTP and HTTPS, which is the default, or whether to scan just using the specified protocols that you've given. So in general, if you aren't absolutely sure whether an application uses both protocols and has content and functionality on each one, it's best to leave the default setting. That's all you actually need to do to perform a default scan, is just give Burp the URL and click OK. But we're just going to walk through some other options that you can use to fine-tune the behavior of the scanner and optimize it for different purposes. So down at the bottom here, we have detailed scope configuration. And here you can configure in more detail exactly what is in and out of the scope. So Burp will always begin crawling from the start URLs that you've given it. But here you can specify additional URL prefixes that should be included, or URL prefixes that should be excluded. So if you have other domains or other folders that you want to include in the scan, you can add them under the included prefixes. If you have parts of an application that you don't want to include, you put them under exclude. The scan configuration section is where you can configure a mass of other options to control how the scanner works. One way to do this is to add a new configuration, and you can specify whether it's for crawling or auditing. So let's start with crawling. And here we have sections for various areas of configuration, and you can expand each of these to define it. So crawl optimization, you can control the link depth. You can configure the crawl strategy as to whether you prefer speed versus deep coverage. Under crawl limits, you can set some limits for how long the crawl should take, or the maximum number of locations, or the maximum number of requests. You can control how the crawler handles application login functions. So by default, Burp will attempt to self-register a user. If it discovers a user registration function, it will populate that and attempt to use the credentials to log in with during the scan. You can also trigger login failures. This means submitting invalid credentials to reach functionality or behavior that is accessed behind a failed login. So that might be a forgotten password feature. You can control how Burp will handle application errors during the crawl. So whether you want to pause or stop the crawl if there are too many timeouts because the application maybe isn't responding properly. And there are some other miscellaneous options as well. So if we create a configuration for auditing, it works in the same way, but we have a bunch of different options. So under audit optimization, you can configure whether Burp Scanner should optimize for a faster scan or a more thorough scan, depending on what kind of payloads are being sent. You can also configure the audit accuracy, so you can tell Burp whether to favor fewer false negatives or fewer false positives. So there are some scan checks, some types of techniques that Burp can use to find vulnerabilities, which are inherently prone to false positives because of the kind of evidence that they gather. So one example of those is a SQL injection payload, which, if successful, will cause a time delay. Sometimes time delays happen anyway because of varying latency in the application's responses or other delays, and sometimes they can line up with Burp's payloads. So Burp will repeat those payloads several times to establish a correlation, but this is where you can configure how much of a correlation to look for and whether to favor false positives or false negatives. You can configure the kind of issues that Burp will report. So you can select these by the type of scan technique that is being used. So at one extreme, we have passive techniques, passive issues, which can be reported just by examining the application's normal traffic, sending normal requests. The other extreme, we have intrusive active scans, which involve a lot of more heavy payloads being sent to the application. These can, in some applications, cause damage if the application is vulnerable. And in between, you have light and medium active vulnerabilities. Burp Scanner also does JavaScript analysis, so it will use static analysis and dynamic analysis techniques on the rendered page, on the DOM, to discover vulnerabilities, and you can configure whether to do that. If you prefer, you can configure individual vulnerabilities to be checked for, and you can configure the specific detection methods that are being used to find those. So as you can see, Burp can scan for masses and masses of different vulnerabilities. You can configure how application errors are handled during the audit, similar to during the crawl. So you can skip insertion points or skip audit items if you see too many errors. You can configure the types of insertion point that are used. So you can configure whether that will place payloads into locations like URL parameters, body parameters, and other types. You can optionally tell Burp to move some parameters to different locations and audit them again there. So this occasionally is useful. You'll have some applications where there's a parameter that is normally in the URL, and there's something like a web application firewall that is filtering payloads that appear in the URL. But if you switch that parameter to the body, it still reaches the application. The application is agnostic as to where it appears, but it bypasses the WAF, and you can maybe reach a vulnerability. This ends up taking a fair bit longer in the scan because we have to do all the work multiple times for different parameters, but sometimes that's really useful. You can configure whether to ignore certain types of insertion points. There are some well-known insertion points based on their name or their type that are part of platform frameworks and features that we don't normally expect to see vulnerabilities in, and you can configure those there. You can configure how Burp handles frequently occurring insertion points. So there are insertion points like cookies, where the same parameter will appear everywhere in every request, and Burp can do a full audit of that every time it appears, but it's generally not very efficient to do that. So by default, what Burp will do for all kinds of insertion points is, if it sees them occurring frequently, it will begin doing a normal, thorough audit, and if they prove to be boring, so if the same insertion point always leads to the same vulnerabilities or no vulnerabilities at all, it will gradually scale back to a faster scan to be more efficient on those insertion points. There are some other options for insertion points, whether to use nested insertion points to see one type of data inside another, and you can configure some details about how Burp does JavaScript analysis, whether to use dynamic techniques or static techniques, and whether to request missing JavaScript dependencies that are needed to render the page. One thing that's worth pointing out about how the scan configuration options work is that within each of these dialogues, each section is collapsed by default, and that means it's not defined. And if you expand it, then you're defining just the options for that section. So if you save a configuration with one section expanded, you're just defining the settings for that section. And what that means is you can add multiple scan configurations that just configure settings in specific areas. So you might start with your general base configuration that you like to use, and then you can add in additional configurations after that to fine-tune different areas of the options. Burp also has a configuration library. This contains various built-in predefined configurations that you can use for different purposes, and you can also easily create your own custom configurations, save them to the library, and then quickly select them later. Under application login, you can provide Burp with credentials for known accounts that exist, which will be used during the crawl and audit. So if you provide these, when Burp finds a login form, it will log in using those credentials, and if any new content and functionality is discovered, that will be crawled and audited within the user context. So you can add multiple of these. You might have one for ordinary users, or you might have one for a manager role within an application or an administrator, and Burp will use each of these separately and discover content. Finally, under resource pools, you can configure how Burp will make use of your network resources that you have. So you can configure the maximum number of concurrent requests that the scan can make, or you can configure the delay between requests if you want to impose some throttling. This can be useful if you have a very fragile application that you can't scan very quickly. You can make Burp slow down, or if you are doing a lot of scans in parallel and you don't want to overwhelm your own machine or your network connection, you can limit the total amount of traffic that can be generated from all the scans together. Anyway, to launch a scan, all you really need is the URL. So that's what we're going to provide, and then we're going to click OK to launch the scan. So when we do that, you can see in the dashboard, in the task list, we have this new entry which represents the scan, and it says crawl and audit of the URL that I provided. You can see in this status line here, the scan progresses through various different phases, and it tells you what you're doing, and it gives a progress bar for each phase so you can see how the scan is progressing. What you also have is the request count, the numbers of errors that have been encountered, and the number of locations that have been discovered during the crawl. And then when the scan moves on to the audit phase, you can see the number of issues that have been discovered. What you also have on the top right is the issue activity log, and this is where vulnerabilities will appear in real time as they're discovered for you to monitor the progress of the scan. You also have an event log where various information, various errors, any other details that you might need to be aware of will appear. Now, as well as the issue activity log, the other main place where issues get reported is in the target tab. So this will give you a site map of all the content that has been discovered. It will let you see all of the individual requests and responses that were found during the crawl, and it will also report all of the vulnerabilities that were found. And you can drill into individual folders and see the vulnerabilities that exist just within those paths, or you can look at everything together. And the way Burp reports issues is that it gives you all of the information that you need, all of the evidence to understand the issue. So here we have a cross-site scripting vulnerability, and we can see the full request and the highlighted payload that was sent. And then in the response, we can see the payload came back and the site is vulnerable. Different types of vulnerability will report different evidence. So here we have one that is using Burp Collaborator to detect an external service interaction. So we send a payload with a URL on Burp Collaborator, and that caused a DNS interaction for that domain name. The second way of performing vulnerability scans is to send individual items to be audited. So anywhere in Burp, you can select one or more requests, choose scan from the context menu, and send them to scanning. So I'm going to go to Burp Proxy and open Burp's browser, and I'm going to visit a URL. So I'm going to forward all the traffic through the proxy, and then in the history, we can see the request that happened. I can select one of these and do scan. If we do that, the scan launcher opens in the normal way, but we now have a third option, which is to audit the items that I had selected. And here we can see that one URL that I'd selected is in the list. All the other options are the same, except for application login, because we're not going to do a crawl now. There are no login settings. And to audit that single item, we just click OK, and the audit begins. If we go to the dashboard, we can see we have this new task, just doing an audit of that single item. If we do that again, we select a different item and do scan. We now select Open Scan Launcher. Scan Launcher opens for this different item. The first time we launched a scan in this way, Burp created a new scan task to do the work. We now have the option whether to add this new item to that same task or whether to create a new task for it. And what that means we can do is we can select different scan configurations to use for different items. I'm going to go to the configuration library and select light active audit checks. If I launch this scan and go to the dashboard, you can now see there are two audit tasks. The first one using the default configuration, and the second one using the audit checks light active configuration. Now, having done that, what we can do if we want is to select a different item. And when we look at the scan context menu, we can see we can open the scan launcher, or we can send this item directly to one of our existing tasks. So this is a really nice way to have different tasks set up and running with different configurations. And as you work manually, you can direct individual requests to a specific task with a specific configuration. That's all the ways of launching scans. So now let's take a look at how you can monitor scans as they're progressing and view the results. So on the dashboard entry for a task, you can click on View Details, or this little icon, to open some more details about the scan in progress. So on this Details tab, we have pretty much the same details that are shown on the face of the dashboard. You can see requests, errors, locations that were crawled, numbers of issues discovered during the audit. You can also open the configuration for the scan and change some of the settings as it's in progress. You go to the Audit Items tab. This shows you all of the items that have been discovered during the crawl, and you can view their progress through the different phases of the audit. So you can see the passive phases, the active phases, the JavaScript work. You can see the full URL. You can see the number of issues that have been reported for each item, numbers of requests and errors. If you double click on an item, you can see the base request and response. So this really gives you complete visibility into what Burp is doing during the scan. You have the Issue Activity tab. This contains the same detail as on the dashboard, but just for this one task, this one scan. So you can select individual issues and you can drill into the evidence to examine them as before. And you also have the event log, which just contains the event log entries for this task. Finally, if you want to generate a scan report containing the issues that were discovered, you can do that. Anywhere that you see issues, you can select one or select many and choose Report Selected Issues from the context menu. You can also, in the sitemap, select a folder or a host and go to Issues and say Report Issues for this host. So if we do that, we open the reporting wizard. We can choose HTML or XML format. You can select which types of details to include in the report. You can select whether to include full HTTP requests and responses or just relevant extracts to avoid the report getting too big. You can select which issue types to include if you want to exclude some of them, and then you can save the report. So if we give the report a name and save it, that report's been generated. We can then open that report and view it. Here we can see the report. We have a summary at the top showing us the number of issues that have been reported by severity and confidence. And we can drill down and see all of the individual issues, and each one by default will include all of the background and remediation detail, and where applicable it will have requests and responses including the highlights of the interesting parts. So that's how to scan a website for vulnerabilities using Burp Scanner, how to monitor what scans are doing while they're running, and how to report results. In this tutorial, we'll cover how to test WebSockets with Burp Suite and all of the different functions that support that. WebSockets are long-lived connections that support asynchronous communications in both directions. Burp Suite has a rich set of tools to support testing of WebSockets for security issues. To see how this works, I'm going to use Burp's embedded browser to visit one of the Web Security Academy labs that covers WebSockets. So this lab has now opened a WebSocket connection, and if we look in Burp's proxy history, we can see a WebSocket negotiation request that returns a 101 message saying switching protocol. And in the WebSockets history tab in Burp, we can see some WebSockets messages. If we go to the lab and type a message, we can see more messages showing the communication in each direction. You can also use Burp Proxy to intercept, view, and modify WebSockets messages on the fly in both directions. So if we turn on Proxy Interception and send a message, we can see our message appears in the Intercept window for us to view and modify. So now I'm going to edit the contents of this message on the fly. And we'll see the message that I edited now appears in the user interface. Using the proxy to intercept and modify WebSockets messages in this way provides a basic way to test for vulnerabilities. You can configure in Burp Proxy's options whether WebSockets messages in each direction are stalled for interception. You can also use Burp Repeater for more advanced tasks to test WebSockets messages. So you can select a message in the WebSockets history and choose Send to Repeater. You can now resend this message over and over, and you can edit it and continue sending it. As we're working in Repeater, the messages that are happening in both directions are shown here in the history panel. This shows the contents of the message, the direction in which it was sent, whether we sent it manually using Repeater or whether it was sent by the server or via the proxy through the browser. It shows the length of the message and the time. The WebSocket ID is a unique identifier in Burp that just references the WebSocket through which this was sent. As we select messages in the history view, the contents of the message is shown at the bottom. We can select a message and choose Edit and Resend. This sends that message back to the left-hand panel, which is where we can edit the message some more and resend it. We can also control the direction in which the message is sent. And if we have this box checked, which says Select Next Message Receives, this means that the message that comes back next in the other direction will be automatically selected and displayed in the bottom right. So this gives you a way to work a bit like the way you can with HTTP messages, where we send a message out and then we view the message that comes back. If we go back to the browser, you can see that messages that we have been sending in Repeater are appearing in the UI. And this is because we are injecting into the live WebSocket that the browser has connected with the server. If we type another message into the browser UI, we can see the resulting messages appearing in Burp Repeater. You can also control the WebSocket connection in which messages are sent. If we click on this pencil icon at the top of the Repeater UI, here we can see a list of all of the WebSockets that have been created in this session of Burp, which tool in Burp created them, and whether they're still open. You can select any open connection and click Attach to attach to that connection. This can be useful if you've become disconnected. You can use your browser in the normal way to re-establish a new WebSocket connection, and then you can attach into it directly from Repeater. You can also clone an open connection and create a new one that's just like it, or you can select any closed connection and click on Reconnect. In both cases, Burp lets you reconfigure the negotiation request that was used to create this WebSocket. So here we've got full edit access to the details of the request that will create the WebSocket. This capability is unique to Burp Suite and it's very powerful. There are often interesting bugs to be found by manipulating the request in the negotiation handshake before the WebSocket is opened. Have a play with some of the labs in the Web Security Academy for examples of this. You can disconnect or reconnect the socket that you're working on using this switch next to the pencil at the top of the UI. And you can create a brand new WebSocket tab in Repeater by clicking on the three dots in the tab header, selecting WebSocket, and then selecting the WebSocket that you want to attach to. So that's how to test WebSockets with Burp Suite and all of the different functions that can support your testing. In this tutorial, we'll cover how to use Burp Proxy interception rules and all of the associated options. Burp Proxy is the tool that you can use to intercept, view, and modify all the traffic passing between your browser and the application you're testing. So to see how that works, I'm just going to open Burp's embedded browser and visit a URL. So when I do that, the requests come through in the proxy intercept view in Burp so that you can view, modify, and forward them. If you're testing a modern application, this can result in a large number of requests and responses, and it can become a bit too much to intercept and view them all and keep having to click forward. So you can use Burp's interception rules to control exactly what gets intercepted. We do that in the proxy tool in the options tab, these settings for intercept client requests and intercept server responses. So to intercept anything, you need to check the box in each section. So by default, requests are intercepted. By default, responses are not intercepted. And you also need to have your master interception toggle on. Otherwise, everything will get passed through automatically. You could define multiple rules to determine what gets intercepted. So each of these rules can be individually toggled to enable or disable it. So you can have rules set up that you might use from time to time. You don't have to have them enabled all the time. The enabled rules are processed in order from top to bottom, and the results are combined using Boolean operators. And this is a simple left to right logic with no configurable scope. By default, for requests, Burp will intercept requests whose file extension does not match a list of fairly boring common file extensions for images, style sheets, scripts, and other things. In general, you're less interested in those page resources when you're working. There are some other rules that are there by default but are not enabled. So you can say that you will intercept any request containing parameters, or if the HTTP method does not match the usual get or post, you can enable interception only of items that are in your target scope. For responses, the default rule, if you enable response interception, is that only responses where the content type header contains the word text will be intercepted. And there are some other rules which you can use for common purposes. So if you want to always intercept a response when you modified or intercepted the request, you can enable these rules. You can ignore all responses with a 304 status code. 304 status code means to use a local cached copy, and this is generally quite a boring response. And again, you can configure only to intercept responses that are in your target scope. If you create an interception rule, the way it works is you define the Boolean operator that will be used to combine it with preceding rules, and then you pick the attribute that you want to set a rule for. So for requests, you have a whole list of different attributes like domain, IP address, the protocol, method, URL, all these sorts of things. You can define a rule whether to match on them, and you can define does match or does not match depending on whether you want to intercept. The match condition can be a regular expression, so you've got real flexibility in what kind of items you match on. So to see how this works, I'm going to turn interception back on, and I'm going to browse a bit around the Portswigger website. And as we do this, you'll see that lots of requests happen. Some of them are requests for portswigger.net, and some of them are for other domains like Google Analytics that we're not as interested in. So what I'm going to do is create a interception rule that ignores anything that isn't on the portswigger.net domain. So I'll create a rule and use the AND operator and say I want to match on the domain name, and I just want to intercept items that are on the portswigger.net domain. I've defined that rule. It gets enabled by default. If I now go back to interception and browse around a bit more, you will see that those requests no longer get intercepted. So now that we've narrowed down interception just to the domain that we're interested in, you'll see that quite often as you browse around, you see requests for items that you actually aren't completely interested in, even if they're on the same domain. So here we can see we get lots of requests for this bundles URL that contains a lot of JavaScript bundles that we maybe are not interested in intercepting all the time. So the way we can deal with that is we can add another interception rule, and we can say I'm going to match on the URL, and I want it URLs that do not match that URL prefix. So if I define this rule, enables it by default. If I then browse around some more, we can see that requests are intercepted for the web security URL, but not for that bundle's URL, even though those requests are still happening in the background. Now, there's another way that we can use interception rules to achieve this same thing. So I've defined individual rules for the domain name and the URL. A different way to do that is to use target scope. So I'm just going to disable those two rules so they're no longer applicable. And I'm going to go in the sitemap and I'm going to add portswigger to scope. And I'm going to exclude the bundle's URL from scope. So if we look at the scope definition, we can see that portswigger.net is in scope and that bundle's URL prefix is out of scope. So what we can now do in our proxy options is we can enable this interception rule that was there but disabled by default to say that we'll only intercept items when the URL is in target scope. So if we now browse around some more, we can see this is working. We get requests for the right URL path and we don't get anything else. For response interception rules, there are a few additional options that don't apply to requests. So we can define rules based on whether the request was intercepted or was modified or was annotated in our proxy testing workflow. We can intercept based on the status code or the content type header or the MIME type or the page title. So to see how response interception rules work, I'm going to create a rule that says I will intercept responses only if the request was modified. And I'm going to turn on interception responses. So if we browse around some more, we will see that requests are being intercepted in the normal way, but no responses. And if we edit one of these requests, we then see that the response gets stalled for interception because it matched on the rule to say that the request had been modified. And when you're working in the interception view of Burp, there are some nice helper functions that can speed up your work. Using the context menu or using the action menu at the top, we have some options to define interception rules. So we can, on any particular intercepted request, we can say, don't intercept requests to this host, IP address, file extension, or directory. Or if we want, we can say, do intercept just the response to this one request, and that will override any of the interception rules that you've got configured. So that's how to use Burp Proxy interception rules and all of the associated options. In this tutorial, we'll explain project options in Burp Suite and how you can save and load your favorite project options. Project options include everything within the Project Options tab at the top of Burp, and also everything within individual tools in their Options tab. If you use an on-disk project, these options are automatically saved within the project data. So any changes that you make are maintained when you reopen an existing project. But you can also save project options to a configuration file so that you can use these again. One way to do this is through the project menu, go to Project Options and Save Project Options. So if I just give this a name, we've saved them. You can also do this from individual configuration panels if you click the Save Options item from the gear icon. This will just save the options for that single panel. So if we restart Burp, when Burp reopens, we can select to use the configuration file that we saved. This means that the new project will get created using those options that I saved to disk. We can also load project options at any time through the project menu, or within individual panels, we can do the same thing through the gear icon and choose load options. If you wish, you can configure Burp to always load your preferred config file by default for new projects. So to do this, in the Startup Wizard, if you select your preferred config file and check this box that says default to the above in future, that means in future, when you start and you open a new project, Burp will select the same configuration file by default without you having to choose it. So that's how project options work in Burp Suite and how you can save and load your favorite options. In this tutorial, we'll cover how to use projects in Burp Suite and various functions that are useful when you're dealing with project files. Burp projects let you organize your work on a specific test. When you launch Burp, it shows this wizard on Startup. And here you can choose what kind of project to open. You can open a temporary project. This is ideal for quick tasks. All the data is held in memory, nothing is saved by default, and your work will be lost when Burp exits. You can choose to create a new project on disk. This means that all your data is saved in a project file. It's saved incrementally in real time as you work, and also your memory usage when you're using Burp will be lower because a lot of data is pushed onto the disk. Finally, if you created a project on disk previously, you can open it. So let's create a new project and give it a name. We need to select where we're going to save the project. And when we do that, if we want, Burp will just give us a default file name to save it to. If we click Next, this is where we choose the configuration options to use for the project. We'll explain these in a different tutorial. So click Start Burp, and Burp opens with the project we created. At this point, as normal, we would do some work and create some data. So I'm just going to create a quick new scan. And I'm going to do just a bit of lightweight browsing using Burp's browser. So now we can see we've got some data in the proxy history and we have a scan running on the dashboard. So at this point, I'm just going to close Burp. If we launch Burp again, we have the same startup wizard, and now we can see that the project that I previously created is listed here for us to select. So I'm going to select to open that project. One thing worth noting is that automated tasks are paused by default when you open an existing project. So this will affect live tasks, scans, and anything else that's running in the task list in the dashboard. I'm going to select the option to use the options that were saved with the project. All project options are automatically saved within the project file, so anything we've customized as we were working will be preserved when we reopen the project. So click Start Burp, and the project I selected will open. The project opens pretty much instantly, the same time it took to create a new project. If you did have a huge amount of work saved in your project file, it might take a little bit longer to open. So here we can see task execution is paused because that's the default behavior. We can see the scan that I created is sitting there where it left off. We can see the data that we accumulated in the proxy history is still there, and other data that we accumulated as we were working is still there. At this point, I can now resume task execution, and that means the scan that was in progress will resume as before. It's worth mentioning that if you reopen a project file where you previously did some vulnerability scanning, when you reopen the file, Burp will resume collaborator polling and will sometimes report some vulnerabilities retrospectively, which were triggered after the end of your previous scanning. There are some other functions which are useful when you're working with project files. If you create a temporary project, you can save a copy of it from the project menu. And you can do the same thing if you've made an on-disk project and you want a second copy of the project file. In both cases, you can choose which burp tools to include data from and whether to only include in-scope items. This can be really useful to reduce the size of a large project file. You can also import a project file. This is really useful if you want to merge your work together from something you produced on another occasion. And also Burp creates backup copies of your project files automatically by default. You can configure this if you go to User Options, MISC, Automatic Project Backup. Here you can configure how frequently the backup files are created and some other options. So that's how to use Burp Suite projects and various functions that are useful when working with project files. In this tutorial, we'll cover how live tasks work in Burp Suite. We'll show how you can set them up, and we'll explain the live tasks that Burp creates by default. Live tasks are used to process traffic from specific Burp tools and perform defined actions on them. Let's see how they work. To create a live task, in the Burp Suite dashboard, you click on the New Live Task button. Here you can define the task type, and the options are Live Audit, which performs a vulnerability scan, or Live Passive Crawl, which adds entries to the target sitemap. You can define the tool scope, and this means the tools whose traffic will be inspected to select items that are processed by the live task. You can choose Proxy, Repeater, or Intruder. So some common use cases might be to use Proxy so that you can use your browser to control which requests get sent for a vulnerability scan. So if you want to visit certain application endpoints, certain features, you can audit exactly the requests that result from those. With Repeater, you might create a live task to add everything that you request through Burp Repeater to the target sitemap. Or for Intruder, you might create a live task to scrape all the responses that come through Intruder looking for new URLs. You can configure the URL scope, and this defines which items are processed by the live task based on their URL. So you can configure the task to include everything, or to use the suite scope if you define one, or you can define a custom scope just for this task. You can also configure whether to deduplicate items that you've seen before based on their URL and parameter names. So for some live tasks, it would be wasteful to repeat the same action again on the same URL and query string. So here you can configure not to do that. Under configuration, you can set other options that are applicable to the live task, and we'll look at those in a minute. And you can also configure the resource pool, which affects how many requests can be made by this task in parallel if you've set that up. The resource pool just works exactly the same as other types of tasks, other scans. So we're going to set up a live audit task. And to do that, I'm going to select traffic through the proxy. And I'm going to define a custom scope for the task. I'm going to turn on deduplication. And under configuration, I'm going to select audit checks medium active. So I'm going to click OK to create that task. You can see it appears in the dashboard here. So to see the task in action, I'm going to open Burp's embedded browser, and I'm going to visit a URL. I'm just going to turn off interception in the proxy so that all the traffic gets passed through. And now on the dashboard, we can see the number of requests that have been made by this task, and we can see the number of issues that have been reported. And if I browse around some of the URLs, we can see more requests are happening and more issues are being reported. If you click on View Details, you can see the full details for this task, just as you can for any scan task, and you can drill right in and see all of the items that have been selected to be audited, and you can monitor their progress. So this kind of task is really useful because it lets you use your browser to guide Burp Scanner through parts of an application and just audit the items that you're interested in, just the items that you visit. So now let's look at how live passive crawl works. So this task is used to add items to Burp's target sitemap. So I'm going to select the proxy again, and I'm going to define a custom scope. And in configuration, because this is a passive crawl task, we have some different options. And here we can configure what types of item to add to the sitemap and which URLs to add. So I'm just going to leave those as defaults for now and create that task. So again, we have an entry in the dashboard showing this task for live passive crawl. And to see how this works, again, I'm going to open the browser and visit a URL. And if I forward the traffic, we can now see 2 responses have been processed and 15 items have been added to the sitemap. And if we go to the sitemap, we can see that it's partly populated based on the traffic that was processed through the proxy. The items that are showing in solid white have been requested, and all the other items have been inferred from responses passing through the proxy but haven't yet been requested. If we look at the dashboard for the live passive crawl tasks, we see there are 2 controls. One is to pause capturing, and one is to pause the task itself. So if we pause the task and make some more requests, we can see we now have some responses queued. So these responses have been captured and they're waiting to be processed, but because we paused the task, nothing's happening yet. So if we unpause the task, they get processed in the normal way. If instead we turn capturing off and make some more requests, you'll see we don't get any additional responses queued. So here we can just turn off the capture, and here we can turn off the processing of the items that have been captured. When you create a live task, there are some predefined tasks that can be instantly added into the configuration of the wizard for common purposes, which you can use directly or which you can customize further to meet your needs. When Burp first opens, in default settings, you'll see that there are 2 live tasks that are created for you by default. So the first of these is a live passive crawl task, which will add items to the sitemap as you browse. It adds links based on the item itself, any URLs observed on the same domain, or any URLs that are in suite scope. And you also have a live audit task, which just does purely passive audit checks of all traffic. These default live tasks are replacements for features that previously, prior to Burp 2, were implemented directly within the scanner tool and the proxy tool. These have now been repurposed as general live tasks, which you can edit and customize further. So that's how live tasks work in Burp Suite, how to set them up, and the live tasks that Burp creates by default. In this tutorial, we'll explain how to configure target scope in Burp Suite and describe all of the different purposes that target scope can be used for. You use target scope to tell Burp what you're currently testing. Burp can then make use of this in various places to control what happens and help to improve your efficiency. To configure target scope, you go to the Target tool and the Scope tab. Scope is based on URLs. By default, nothing is in scope, and you add things to scope by adding them to the include list. If necessary, you can then exclude some items from scope by adding them to the exclude list. A URL will be in scope if it matches something in the include list and doesn't match anything in the exclude list. Some common ways to configure scope are that you can include a single domain, or a folder or path within a domain, or you can configure multiple domains and paths together. You can use exclude rules for various purposes, such as excluding boring content from scope, or excluding functionality that is out of the scope for the test you're doing, or to exclude fragile functionality that might break if you test it, or functionality that is liable to break other activities, such as killing your session, deleting your account, or things like that. By default, target scope works off simple URL prefixes, and this is suitable for most purposes. If you enable advanced scope control, you can then define scope rules based on each part of the URL individually: the protocol, the host or IP address, the port number, the file path, and you can use regular expressions for each item. This is useful for more complex cases. For example, if you want to exclude URLs in different folders where the file name matches a certain pattern. In general, the easiest way to define scope is to browse the target application with Burp's browser and then use the context menu on the sitemap or tree or table to define the scope. So you can use the context menu, select an item and say add to scope, and then you can select items beneath that, use the context menu and say remove from scope. If you do this, then the scope configuration will be updated to reflect the items that you've selected. So what can you use target scope for? Well, the first thing that happens is that when you do add an item to scope, Burp will prompt you to ask whether the proxy should stop sending out of scope items to the proxy history or to other Burp tools. This can help keep your data clean, reduce the size of project files, and reduce memory usage. In the sitemap, there is a view filter, so you can select to only show in-scope items. Everything else gets hidden from the view. You can do the same in the proxy history. Burp Proxy's interception rules can be based on the target scope. So you can define rules which will only intercept items if they're in target scope. If you've configured a target scope and you go to perform a scan, Burp will automatically pre-configure the URLs to scan based on your scope. And in your crawl options, you can configure whether out-of-scope resources should be fetched by the embedded browser during the scan. If you create a live task, you can configure the scope of the task based on the target suite scope. If you use Burp's search function, you can configure whether only in-scope items should be included in the search. When you save a copy of your project, you can also configure whether to only include in-scope items. In Burp Intruder, you can configure whether Intruder should follow redirections and the URLs that should be included in the redirection. So you can configure whether to base redirections on what is in target scope. And you can do the same thing in Burp Repeater as well. If you use Burp session handling rules, each session handling rule can be configured based on your target scope. And finally, if you go to project options and connections, you can configure whether all out-of-scope requests should be dropped regardless of where they're coming from within Burp. So that's how to configure target scope in Burp Suite and all of the different purposes that target scope can be used for.